Welcome to Tales from the Rabbit Hole. I'm your host, Mick West. My guest today is Ian, who goes by the name TheoryQED on Metabunk and on YouTube. Ian is very interested in the UFO phenomenon, and we've discussed it on Metabunk in a variety of threads. I think Ian would say that he and I have somewhat differing opinions about what UFOs likely are and about a variety of the different incidents. So we're going to discuss our differences and things that we agree on. So Ian, welcome to Tales from the Rabbit Hole.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Well, thank you very much for being here. All right, so let's kind of get into it. Like, how would you define a UFO?
That's a great question. So I saw recently you posted on Twitter a real UFO that you had taken, which is just a blurry, faraway picture.
Uh-huh.
And that's a good point that anything unidentified is a real UFO. But in my opinion, when people that are interested in UFOs say the word real UFO or genuine UFO, what we usually mean is something that has been verified. So it's not just one person with a blurry camera image that we can't verify, but instead it would be something with outstanding evidence like what we have with the Navy, where we have radar corroboration, multiple witnesses, and it can be verified with tangible data.
Now, do you remember the Chilean UFO from
I do.
Years ago? That was described as a verified UFO, but it turned out it wasn't. Would you say it was a verified UFO at the time, or it was a mistakenly verified UFO?
That's a great point, too, because it is somewhat subjective, depending on what your opinion is. Obviously, you think that it's not a UFO, but the Chilean government does think that it's a UFO, correct?
I don't think the Chilean government as such does, no. I'm pretty sure, actually, they would accept the explanation now, seeing as it was a perfect match for this particular radar track. It was in the exact point in space.
Okay.
Just for people who aren't familiar with this was a kind of a distant-looking UFO that was taken by a Chilean Navy helicopter using their infrared thing. They were looking for like smugglers and whatnot, and they saw this thing, and they couldn't figure out what it was. It wasn't on the radar. It wasn't responding to radio, and so they gave it to this Chilean Air Force body that was set up to investigate UFOs or anomalous aerial phenomena, and they couldn't figure out what it was after a couple of years, even though they had a few theories about it might be a plane, but then they said, no, it can't be a plane because of this and that. And then they eventually released it, and then people on the internet pointed out that there was a plane in that exact spot visually that was departing the airport at that time, and if you do a 3D recreation, it matches perfectly.
That's a great explanation, but I think it still doesn't completely explain why it wouldn't respond to radar calls. And I agree with you that your explanation is definitely plausible, if not even likely. I like your explanation for that case. But I do think that it's still being portrayed as a real UFO because it was on Contact recently where they said that the temperature was 700 degrees. And you had a great point that you can't know that temperature just by looking at the footage. It's only relativistic. You can't determine an exact temperature. But that brings us to the 5 observables. So if that video had shown one of the 5 observables or more than one of the 5 observables where it's doing hypersonic speeds or something like that, then we can rule out the passenger plane explanation, and then it would be even more of a genuine UFO. So
the 5 observables, this is something someone has suggested that, was it one of them needs to be there to be a UFO?
I think this comes from ATIP, and yes, I think it is at least one. And we have anti-gravity lift, which is a bit subjective because it could be a lighter than aircraft. Obviously, it could be some kind of blimp. Sudden and instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic velocities without signatures, so no visible exhaust plumes, low observability or cloaking, both visually or on radar, and also transmedium travel. So going into water, coming out of water, going into space, flying through the air, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I guess the Chilean one wouldn't really...
Yeah, so I agree with you there that it's not such a strong case because your explanation makes sense.
Yeah, and also you said why didn't it show up on radar? And the reason was that they were looking 50 miles ahead of them when it should have been looking 100 miles ahead of them. they didn't.
And that's understandable. But
Yeah.
didn't they try to contact it with the radio control tower? Didn't they
but
say?
no, they didn't. They just hailed it on the hailing frequency, which is like when you're in a plane, people think that you can just like radio a plane, like a jet flies up and radios a plane, but it has to be on the correct frequency. So you need to know what frequency they are listening to. And when a plane is departing an airport, it will be on either the tower frequency as it's taking off, or it'll be on the departure frequency, which is the people who organize the planes leaving the area. And then there's separate frequencies for arrivals, and there's another one for the ground. And when planes just flying around, it's the common frequency, which I think is 121.0, as I remember. It's been a while since I actually flew a plane. But they would have hailed it on that frequency. They would have assumed that it's just a plane flying around, so they would have hailed it on 121.0. They would have assumed it wasn't a plane departing the airport. If they thought it was a plane departing the airport, they would have been looking in a completely different place, so they wouldn't know to go to the departure frequency for that plane. So that's why it didn't respond to radio calls, because they were just using the 121 thing and not the departure thing. And the same thing with radar. They would have looked on their radar, which would have showed them things that were nearby them, like within 40, 50 miles, when the airport was actually, I think, 80 miles to the north of them, and the plane was already turning and going north of the airport at that point. So, I've heard, objections like that before, and they've all been explained. And as far as I can tell, it's like 100% on that particular case. I don't really think that, if you actually check all the boxes, that you can actually really argue that. Now, this isn't something we could say for the other cases, which we're going to discuss in the future. But we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here. Like, so we were talking about what is a UFO, and you were saying like it has to be kind of verified. But when you say verified, does that mean more than one person has to see it?
Yes, personally, I think it should be more than one person that has seen it. And ideally, you would also have some sort of testable evidence that you have along with that witness. So you would have either video or radar or some sort of electromagnetic disturbance or something that you can test to say that something physical was there. That's just my personal opinion.
Yeah, I know people, say we shouldn't discount eyewitness testimony, but it's obviously vastly better if you can corroborate eyewitnesses with video and put them side by side and said, the guy says I saw this, and you show a video that shows the same thing. That would be great. Have you ever seen a UFO?
I actually did very recently. I hesitate to call it a UFO because I have only my witness account, and then I have a decent picture and a terrible video of this UFO. And the best way I can describe it would be a Chinese lantern. It was an orange ball of light, and it's going up into the sky. I don't think that they would have released a Chinese lantern where I live in Boulder, Colorado. But if that's what it was moving quite quickly. It was very large, very bright, and it disappeared pretty fast in an upward direction. So I've already got plans to go to a lantern festival and see if that's what I saw.
Yeah, it's good to try to replicate these things, like because was it at night or fairly dark?
It was.
Yeah, it's very hard to see where things are at night.
Yeah, it seemed very close.
Yeah. You see sometimes people will look at landing lights of planes, which are quite a distance away, like about 40 miles away. And because the lights are pointing straight at them, the plane's coming straight towards them, it looks like it's a light that's rising up in the sky, when actually it's kind of coming towards them just very, very slowly and just going overhead. So it's very, very difficult to corroborate these things. So you've had a UFO sighting. I guess I always say I see UFOs every day. Because I live under the flight path for departures from both Sacramento and San Francisco. So I see the higher planes from San Francisco and the lower planes from Sacramento, and they quite often do that thing where they come straight towards me, and for a while they look like UFOs. I remember one where I was looking at it through my camera, and because I'm getting old now, my eyesight is going, and when I looked at it on the back of the camera, it looked like this really weird star-shaped thing coming towards me. But then I reviewed the footage later, and he was just not star-shaped at all. It was just my bad eyesight. So that's something that comes into play as well. So have you been interested in UFOs for a long time?
I have. Ever since I was in elementary school, I would read the books in the library, and that's how I first got into it.
Yeah, me too. I was always very into UFOs. I used to read magazines that had cases, and I had a bunch of books on UFOs. And of course, big into science fiction as well. I imagine if you're a UFO person, you like science fiction.
I do.
Seems to be a common trait. I read a lot of science fiction, and there's like classics like Arthur C. Clarke. Let's going to get into the 3 videos that people have been talking about recently. There's these 3 videos that have been around for a while. There's the one from the Nimitz encounter, has been around for since 2007, I think.
Right.
And the incident, I think, was 2004, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, so it came out 3 years after. That one's, I think, in many ways, that's the most interesting one in terms of the incident, the overall incident, because there's so many people who said something happened. It seemed like something happened that day. It's not entirely sure what happened, but there's all these different people. So this was in 2004. The Nimitz battle cruiser. It was ahead of a fleet of ships, and they were getting these radar returns that seemed like that they were something flying around, and then they sent out a plane at one point, and then the guy saw what he thought was a Tic-Tac shaped object zipping around, and then it flew off at high speed, and then another plane took a video, and you got this famous video.
Two planes saw it initially.
Yeah.
So a total of 4 people.
Right. Yeah. There was Commander Fravor and his WSO, I guess.
WSO.
Yeah.
Yes.
Weapons systems operator, and then there was a female pilot, a younger female pilot, who was doing high-level support for him. She saw what happened from above.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's that's quite compelling, really. You got at least 2 people giving their direct accounts. I don't know if the other 2 have actually given interviews.
Jim Slate, the WSO from Commander Fravor's plane, he did 1 interview, but that's all he's done so far.
Did he basically corroborate exactly what Fravor said? Yeah.
Yes, they were actually on together. Yep.
Was that on one of the shows, like the Discovery Channel show? Or History?
It was actually mainstream media. I don't remember the channel off the top of my head, but it was on the news.
Right, back when there was a bit of a flurry of interest around, probably when the New York Times thing came out. Yeah, and that's very interesting. What could he have seen? And all these people corroborate it. Yes. It's a bit of a puzzle. He says he saw, he was looking down and saw churning water. What are your thoughts on that whole incident?
Well, first of all, I think it's not a good idea to focus on only the video. I think that's a problem that your website has with all 3 of these videos, or at least 2 of them. I think that we should take into account what the witnesses saw, because, as you said, we have 3 public aviators that have seen the same thing, and then we also have multiple witnesses from both the Nimitz and the Princeton who corroborate the exact same story, different aspects of the same story, but they all tell the same tale along the same lines of each other. And then if you have radar and visual contact, to me, that's a genuine UFO. Even though we didn't have the video of the initial contact at the merge plot point where three public witnesses saw it, we still have the radar in the same spot. And yes, it is possible that it's different objects, but I think it's very likely that the Tic-Tac was the object that they saw on radar because it's in the same place and they saw it visually.
They didn't see the Tic-Tac craft depart the area. Fravor says it flew away, but no one says they saw it fly away on the radar.
I'm not really 100% sure on this. I've asked Kevin Day, and he hasn't responded to my most recent question. But definitely they saw on radar the object zoom from the merge plot point, which is where Commander Fravor first encountered it. And then from there, in under 2 seconds, it's over the horizon. So hypersonic speeds we have there observed. Mm-hmm. And also, Kevin Day said that we saw that on radar, and that the Tic-Tac object went directly to the cap point, which is the combat air patrol point they were using for training. So somehow this object knew the precise location of that training coordinate, and then it zoomed there from their encounter.
Yeah, I don't think they described it as a zoom, though. They just said it's now at your cap point. They didn't show it moving.
Right, but Commander Fravor described it as zooming across his tail, and this was seen by the 20,000-foot high cover, which is the female pilot.
Yeah,
so it zoomed somewhere.
The big problem, is like you get these eyewitness accounts of movement, and then you get these recollections of radars movements, but they don't show the same thing. Like you see the radar says. Kevin Day you talked about, he was the guy who was, I guess, operating it wouldn't be called just the radar, the whole system, the CIS thing,
CEC.
CEC, yes. Yeah, that's, I can't remember what it calls for, Combat Engagement Center or something.
Something like that. It's a cooperative radar system.
Right, yeah, so it synthesizes and puts together all the data from different systems so you can see it on one screen, and should be really good, obviously, because you've got all these inputs. But so he says that he saw it dropping from 80,000 feet to 20,000 feet, and then dropping from, I don't know, where it was 28,000 feet to 50 feet or something like that. So you've got these recollections of this radar data showing one thing, but then you don't have the eyewitnesses showing it dropping. You have them showing it like zigzagging around where they are, being at the ocean surface, and then you have them going away. So you don't get this exact match between video and eyewitness and radar. And the video is completely different again. Like the video just shows like a distant thing that it looks like it's just flying away. It doesn't really move other than getting a bit smaller. So I mean, like, would you consider this really to be the same thing?
I can't say with 100% certainty that all of these objects are the same, but I can say that, in my opinion, I think that they're definitely related. So I don't know if you're familiar with all of the witnesses, but there's a person on board the Nimitz called PJ Hughes, and he's in charge of the E2 Hawkeye radar tapes. So that's a radar plane that was flying around at the time. And Commander Fravor has said that this plane could see the Tic-Tac objects on radar. There's a bit of a discrepancy with that because Dave Beatty, who made the Nimitz Encounter documentary, he told me that at least at one point the windows were open and the radar was off on this plane. But if it did make radar contact, that's another plane in the sky that was seeing all of these things basically the entire time that it was airborne. And those tapes were confiscated by Air Force officials, according to PJ Hughes. So that's a bit anomalous. Why is the Air Force coming on board the Nimitz? That's a Navy
that's very
ship.
Interesting. Kind of a Men in Black type thing, isn't it? Like the way he tells it. And I think the other guy, PJ Hughes, Patrick Hughes. Yeah, I talked to him on Facebook, and I asked him if the radar showed it departing, and he said I should talk to Kevin Day, and I talked to Kevin Day, and he didn't say it did. So
PJ Hughes, I don't think he's actually seen the radar data. I think he was just in charge of holding the tapes in the safe. But he says that his friend Roger, who was on board that E2 plane, he said he could look out the window and see a Tic-Tac right next to his plane. So because we have multiple objects being tracked on radar by the Princeton over that 2-week period, and because we have multiple objects apparently being seen by multiple different planes at the same time or around the same time, I think even if the objects aren't the same from the video, the radar, and the visual sightings, I think that they are probably related in some way.
Yeah, well, they're all in the same space and time.
Exactly.
And the other guy, Gary Voorhis, he was an eyewitness to it. And, you said that, what was his name, Roger, could see it out of the window of the plane. Gary Voorhis said that you could see it from the deck of the Nimitz using binoculars. They have these big 20x binoculars called Big Eyes that are mounted on these platforms above the deck, and you can see them through that. And he said he could even see it through his own personal binoculars. And he says that you could see them for days. But I think he said that they look like little points of light, which is why we call them Tic-Tacs. I could be slightly misquoting him there, but Fravor describes this Tic-Tac as being this oblong, something shaped a bit like this, a capsule, I think is the technical term. It's a cylinder with two domes on the end. But you've got Gary Voorhis saying we saw these points of light and we call them Tic-Tacs. I don't think that kind of rings true in terms of why they call them Tic-Tacs. I think you might be kind of forcing the back explanation onto that. But a lot of what they describe is just points of light. So when people say they're seeing the same thing over and over again, if they're just seeing like a white speck in the distance, I mean, how do you know it's not a seagull?
Well, I would say that the hypersonic radar tracking would prove that it's not a seagull.
Yeah. And the tracking, obviously, like the obvious kind of debunker explanation for radar is that it's just a glitch. There's some kind of problem with the system. And we know that there were problems with the system because they said that we've got all this clutter, we're going to reboot the system, take it down and bring it back up again and recalibrate it, and that should fix it. And then they did that, and then they didn't go away, so they assumed that they were real at that point, or some people assumed they were real.
I think that it doesn't show that there was a problem with the system. I think that they were just testing to make sure that these were in fact real tracks and not ghost tracks. But as you said, when they reinstalled the system, it just got clearer. So it was definitely real. Yeah,
but it shows that they expect there to be problems from time to time. It means that it's not an unexpected event. And obviously we hear about false radar tracks all the time. And even like the pilots say, there's accounts of pilots saying like there was false tracks off my wing and things like that. So it does actually happen, these false tracks. And there's a variety of physical reasons for it, like inversion layers and reflections off big waves and things like that. So they do happen, but we don't know what happened in this case, obviously. But it kind of raises the question, though. Why do you think that the Navy was so unconcerned about this large fleet of flying objects next to the carrier strike group?
I don't know. I mean, maybe they had seen it before and they already knew kind of what they were dealing with, because on the East Coast, those pilots have said that they saw them nearly every day. So it could be that this wasn't the high command's first encounters with these sorts of objects. And it was just kind of a curious thing for the newer people. But Commander Fravor was already a pilot for at least over a decade at the time, and that was his first encounter with it.
Yes, but you don't think that the Navy is just used to seeing alien crafts flying around or advanced technology, and they have been for decades, and no one's mentioned it before?
I don't know. I mean, we'll have to get into the cover-up later with the whole conspiracy thing, but as I said, on the East Coast, they saw those objects almost every day, both on radar and visually, and then those objects also followed them to the Middle East to their deployment in a war zone. So that shows that these objects are either following the carrier battle groups, or it's truly a global phenomenon. And if anybody would know that, it would be the Navy, because they're in every ocean at all times.
Well, back in World War II, they had a thing called a Foo Fighter, which was essentially a UFO. Like they had various theories about what they were, but all pilots see things in the sky at some point or another. And I think. Again, in the stuff that they described in the Gulf, a lot of that was described as being points of light, and not solid objects. There's a few different versions of the solid objects. Do you want to talk briefly about the other videos?
Sure, I'd like to give you credit for the Go Fast analysis. I thought you did a great job with that.
Thank you.
Doing all the math and proving the altitude and the speed.
Yeah, it wasn't too complicated. I think a bunch of other people have done it too. It is just a very simple trick.
And I meant to ask you, if we know the field of view for the Tic-Tac, which I think we do, so we know how wide the field of view is, and if we can estimate the size of the object, whether it's a passenger plane, as you have suggested, or 40 feet long, as Commander Fravor has described the Tic-Tac, if we know the size and the field of view, can we not determine speed and distance from those two things?
Well, yeah, to a degree, yeah. You
just estimate it?
No, yeah, you can say if it's this size, then it must be this far away.
Traveling
assuming that the field of it's not entirely clear what the field of view is
because it changes.
No, it describes what it is in the corner of the screen. There's an NAR, and then there's 1x or 2x. So it's mostly an NAR, which is just a narrow field of view. But from the we don't know the exact specifications of the the atmosphere system, and apparently it varies between like 0.75 and 1 degrees or 1.5 degrees. So it's not exactly good.
So,
But we can get a good ballpark, I think.
do you admit that the object is moving from right to left in that video?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
so then
right
I just
to
wanted
left.
to let you know that the way you have the tail of the plane on the left, the plane would be flying backwards.
Yeah, I
So,
know. Yeah,
okay.
I mentioned
Did
that
you
in
update that?
Yeah, no, I did that. Someone pointed that out almost straight away,
Right.
and I updated it. But yeah, that
Okay.
was just the first plane I picked, and it was probably a mistake to try to read too much into this little bit that appears to be sticking up on one side, because you can, if you take a plane and it could be any shape of plane, and passenger planes have a fairly distinctive shape along, but the military planes have a variety of shapes. Like it could be. A Hawkeye plane has a very different shape because it's got that big radar on top, and jets tend to be chunkier and have their fins in rather different configurations.
And then last question about that. Do you think that there was, in fact, radar jamming during the time that video was taken? Or do you think that there was no radar jamming?
Well, I don't know. I mean, if they have a radar jamming detector that tells them the radar is being jammed, does that only ever go off when the radar is being jammed? And did it actually go off? I think they said
I don't know.
It was being jammed. I suspect it was more like the Chilean case, where they thought it was 30 miles in front of them, and it was actually 60 miles in front of them because it was a bigger jet.
Well, Commander Fravor has said that there was radar jamming and jamming cues, and he said that Chad Underwood has told him that, and he says that it's visible on the tape, the radar tape, not the tape that we've seen. But in the official incident report, it says that Chad Underwood, who was the pilot of the jet that took the video, it says that in that report there was no official jamming cues. So hopefully when Commander Fravor goes on to Joe Rogan, I think in November, hopefully he'll try to clear that up a bit for us.
That will be interesting. Yeah, I should send some questions then. Yes, the official incident report for the Nimitz thing, that I think they say the plane did not appear to move, like it just receded. So the guy who I'm not sure how official that is, that report.
Commander Fravor has said it's the unofficial official report. So he says it's legitimate, but I don't know if it's technically official.
So you would consider it confirmed that the guy who took the video made this report about taking the video?
Well, I think there are a lot of inconsistencies between the witness testimony, what we can see, and also what appears in that incident report. So I think there are a lot of variables that we still need to clear up what actually happened. But I think it's clear that the object is moving from right to left.
Yeah, no, you can tell that from just the angle that's displayed on the screen. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So go fast. You're okay with that being something that's not moving that fast and is in fact 1,300 feet. Do you think it makes any sense that it's a balloon?
No, and I'll tell you why. I think if you look at only Go Fast alone, I think it could be a balloon. But the fact now, I don't know if you've seen it, but now we know that Gimbal and Go Fast were taken on the same day. Yeah. Some people suggest as little as 20 minutes apart. It's definitely the same flight crew, the same people in both videos. So I think that there's a very high likelihood, not certainty, but likelihood that the objects we see in Go Fast might be related to the objects that are supposedly seen in the longer version of the Gimbal video, which are flying in formation. And if those objects are flying against the wind, then I don't think it could be a balloon, assuming it's the same object in both videos.
Yeah. Although it could be that, if they thought that it was moving at a different altitude, like it looks like it's down by sea level, and the wind direction at sea level can be very different to the wind direction at 13,000 feet. It can you can actually be completely different directions. Sea level winds are usually quite slow, and they would. I don't know like what they would do, but they would probably think that I would think they would be going by the wind direction at their altitude, which was 25,000 feet. Go Fast. But
correct. So I was mostly talking about the Gimbal footage.
Oh, okay.
So we can hear on the audio there that they're saying, look on the SA, the situational awareness radar display. There's a whole fleet of them, and they're flying against the wind, and the wind is 120 knots to the west or out of the west. So that's hurricane force winds that these objects are flying in formation and against the wind in that strong of wind. So I think that basically completely rules out birds flying in formation or any type of balloons, even if it has thrusters. I don't think balloons are going to be able to fly against that strong of a wind.
Well, yeah, I don't think the gimbal video, the gimbal video is the one with the rotating shape on it. I don't think that's a balloon at all. I mean, I don't think anyone's ever suggested that would be a balloon, because it's got a very hot heat source, so it's almost certainly is a jet engine of some sort.
To clarify, I'm just talking about the smaller objects in formation that have been described by Lieutenant Ryan Graves.
Yeah.
And I know that you think that his witness testimony isn't necessarily reliable, but he was on the ship with the flight crew. He talked to them right after it happened. He said that these objects in formation were visible on the longer version of the gimbal video. So if that video ever comes to light, I think that those objects are 100% not balloons or birds.
Yeah, well, I guess we probably won't see, unfortunately, because
the
Navy is, in their recent statements, have said that they're going to investigate it, but the investigation will include classified material, so they probably will not tell us the results of it. Which is great for the UFO speculation industry. We can just continue to argue about it for years, but it's rather frustrating that we won't actually know what these things are. Maybe they will say that they've determined that they were not interesting at some point. What about, I have this explanation of the rotation of the gimbal. Like I saying that it's a glare from an infrared thing, and something big, bright light gives a glare that's bigger than the object itself. And when the camera rotates, it makes the glare rotate, and the horizon is derotated. So what do you think of that explanation?
I think it's totally plausible, and I think you did a great job of trying to prove it with showing the lines that you can see in the video, and you did your own experiments too to show that it actually does happen. So I think that's great that you're trying to prove your theory there, and I think it's a likely theory. But the problem I have with all of that is, in your video you said that Dave Falch is an expert in FLIR cameras who has been working on this for a while, and he recently gave you this footage that proves that it is just an out-of-focus jet exhaust and it's rotating because of the camera. But Dave Falch does not agree with any of those statements. He doesn't think it's a jet exhaust, he doesn't think it's out of focus, and he doesn't think that the rotation is just caused by the camera. Yeah. So what I wanted to say is, I don't think that he can be an expert on the gimbal camera equipment and in analyzing the video when he supposedly agrees with you, and then discounted as a novice with fundamentally different equipment when he doesn't agree with you. Because you asked me to reach out to him for a direct comment, and he did, and he made it very clear what he thinks. Yeah, well, and I obviously disagree with him, and I'm not basing my analysis on what he says. I'm basing it on the evidence that he provided. I mean, he I wouldn't say he's an expert, but he's a kind of a technician who works with these cameras in the factory, and he tests them out in the parking lot behind the factory, and he takes video of planes. And I just chatted with him for a while, and we there was two things I wanted him to test, one of which is panning left to right, showing that the camera has to rotate, and he did that, and he showed that the camera does rotate. And the other one was like getting a distant jet with a heat source, and he got that, and it showed that it did actually look somewhat like the video that we see. And if you combine those two things, the rotation of the camera in the panning and this glare, then you get what we see in the videos. I mean, I think you don't need his professional opinion about it. You just need to look at the evidence that he has created. He's created like these nice little videos that actually demonstrate it, I think. So I can understand that, but I still disagree. First of all, did you tell him to do it intentionally out of focus? No, I didn't. No. Okay, so it's just happenstance. Yeah. Well, because he uses these FLIR cameras every day, and admittedly he's not an expert on the military grade, so there might be a difference in clarity, or he might not be an expert on the rotating system as much as just the camera. But even as not a photography expert, I'm not a professional photographer, I can tell when a DSLR is out of focus, and I can tell when my iPhone camera is out of focus. So because he uses these cameras every day, I think he's at least qualified to say that the object we're looking at is completely out of focus and skewed the image is skewed because it's blurry and not in focus, or he can say that it is in focus and the edges are crisp and clear and well defined, which is what he says for the gimbal object.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, there wasn't really anything in the background that you could use to see if the infrared footage that he created was really in focus.
Right.
The clouds in the gimbal footage, I don't think, are really in focus. It's hard to say if a cloud is in focus, especially in a low resolution video, because they're naturally blurry anyway. So if you make them a little bit more blurry, I don't think the focus issue is really a big thing. Like, one of his other objections was that you couldn't see the wings of the plane.
Okay.
And that you could see it in his. But I actually talked to him about that, and I showed him some video, and he kind of agreed with me afterwards that maybe you wouldn't be able to see the wings of the plane. Like in the Chilean case, in that Chilean case, the glare is so big that it covers the entire plane, and that's an A340, which is a big 4-engine plane. So
yeah. And I've seen the longer version, the 10-minute version of that video, and you can't even see the plane even in TV mode. So it's very far off.
The Chilean plane?
Chilean.
Yeah. You can. I think you can just make it out as a little faint speck right at the start in the visible mode.
But in the gimbal, he says that there's no heat spiking or variation in the jet exhaust. So he says it's not a jet exhaust.
Yeah, I think that's just down to differences in the optics. If you notice when that moves over like things like trees and phone lines and stuff like that, you get spiking. The spikes are from diffraction, which is basically light going around corners, and the different shapes of the corners it goes around makes these spikes. So the light path of the camera itself has all these edges in it, like the aperture and the edges of the camera system, and those create spikes. So different cameras have different amounts of spiking, and different brightnesses of glare will have different amount of spiking. So I don't really see that as being a huge issue. I think that's just more down to differences in the situation of what he's videoing and the camera itself.
Okay. Just one more thing on that, if you don't mind.
No, go
In
ahead.
your video, gimbal object or gimbal UFO need not be moving. I noticed that you have the gimbal object as completely stationary.
It was really just an extreme example, just to show that it didn't need to be. I mean, it's almost certainly moving away from them rather than not moving.
Well, two things on that. Lieutenant Ryan Graves has said that the larger object was in fact stationary. He mentioned that in Unidentified episode 4. So I would like to see if you do think that it is a plane or a drone with a jet exhaust that's moving away from the camera. I would like to see you update that need not be moving GIF or GIF and the video as well, just so that you can see the object moving on the graph. Because I think as the plane reaches the apex of its turn, it'll have a horizontal view of the object moving. So we should be able to see some movement in the camera if the object is moving.
Well, I think it's moving almost directly away from the plane, so it's going to...
I understand that, but the plane was behind it, and then it moves off to the side at the apex of its turn. So I think at one point we should be able to see some horizontal movement. Yeah,
I'm not sure. I mean, obviously we do see what looks like horizontal movement with the gimbal video. I mean, it looks like it's moving relative to the clouds. But it's interesting. So that other pilot said that it was not moving at all? Or... He
did. He wasn't very explicit about it, but he definitely said, I can send you the video. He said this larger object that was significantly larger than the smaller objects was stationary.
And he gave this account where he said that there was a large object that looked like a gyroscope, and then there was these 5 smaller objects following it in a V shape.
Right, and he said the smaller objects were moving, and we can hear in the audio of the gimbal video that they're moving against the wind. But in episode 4 of Unidentified, Lieutenant Ryan Graves said that the larger object was stationary. And he definitely said that. He just didn't make a big deal out of it.
Yeah, well, that would be interesting. Let's move on to, you want to talk about the UFO conspiracy.
Oh yes,
like this is like the blog here is my podcast is about conspiracy theories, and UFOs I think are really interesting as a conspiracy theory because on one hand it's this almost banal conspiracy theory that the government is covering up something. They're not telling us everything they know about something, which seems fairly straightforward. But then on the other hand, they're covering up aliens from another planet. which is like just the most amazing thing ever. So you've got kind of two extremes of the conspiracy spectrum in one thing. What's your thought on the government covering up UFOs in some way?
Well, this is going to take a while, but first of all, I'd like to correct a statement that Seth Shostak made in your last show. He said that around 30% of Americans believe in UFOs. I believe that's what he said. And that's not actually correct. 33% of Americans believe that extraterrestrial visitation is the explanation for UFOs. But it's a much higher percentage of people that believe in UFOs and believe that the government is withholding information from us. I looked it up on Gallup in 2019, and it's 68% of Americans believe that the government is withholding information about UFOs. So another thing I'd like to say is that not all conspiracy theories are the same. We're not all created equal. Not all conspiracy theorists are crazy. So flat Earth might be on one end of the spectrum, and then you might have other conspiracies on the other end of the spectrum. And I don't even see UFOs as a conspiracy. I see it as something that's been officially acknowledged by our government. The president has been briefed on UFOs. Congress has classified briefings on UFOs. So I think it's very clear that UFOs are real, and we shouldn't keep asking people, do you believe in UFOs? That's what you ask someone about ghosts or Bigfoot. But I think UFOs are now officially established. And this goes into what Dr. Michio Kaku was talking about with the burden of proof and sufficient evidence to prove their existence. But I think that it's no longer just a fringe conspiracy theory that UFOs are real and that the government's withholding information. I think both of those are very clear, that it is real and that the government at least knows more than they're telling us.
What do you mean by real, though? You keep saying it is real. What does that mean?
Verifiable. We can check instruments to show that they're actually there. It's not just a Bigfoot sighting that has no video and no radar data. It's the Navy saying that we don't know what these things are. We see them on a nearly daily basis. That seems real to me. It's not fairies or ghosts or anything like that.
But like a Bigfoot sighting would be an actual giant ape, whereas UFOs are like blips on radar. So
just the blips on radar are real, at least.
Right. Yeah, definitely. They're real blips.
They need to be explained.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, if you don't mind, I'd like to go over a brief history of the conspiracy. So, 1947, we have the Roswell crash. Initially, it was reported in the newspapers, citing an Army official, that there was a retrieved flying saucer, and then there's also allegedly bodies. So, I'm sure you already know about this, but this is basically the start of the modern conspiracy about the cover-up. So 1947, same year, we have the Twining Memo, written by General Nathan Twining, who later got a 4th star and became the USAF Chief of Staff and then the Chairman of Chief of Staff. And he says flat out, the phenomenon is something real and not visionary or fictitious. So when I say it's real, I mean that it's real to the Navy, and I mean it's real to the Air Force. It's not something that crazy people on the internet are imagining or just making up. It's something that is verifiable by the military. And then B, he says there are objects probably approximating the shape of a disc. So he's talking about flying saucers. And then he goes into the description of these flying saucers: metallic, light reflecting, no tail, circular or elliptical in shape. So he's describing flying saucers in this memo very clearly. And then 2 years later, we have 1949 FBI document sent to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, also sent to the Army's G2, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. And it says that they had meetings in between all these groups discussing UFOs. And it also says that the Army intelligence has recently said that the matter of unidentified aircraft, or the British term unidentified aerial phenomenon, otherwise known as flying discs, flying saucers, balls of fire, is considered top secret by intelligence officers of both the Army and the Air Force. So they were taking this phenomenon seriously all the way back in 1947, 1949. And if you don't mind, I'd like to keep going.
Sure.
So 1952, we have the Washington, D.C. flap. So 2 sightings of UFOs, 2 weekends in a row. And I'd like to ask you, do you know about this case? What do you think about this event?
Was it the lights that were seen over the White House?
Exactly, in the Capitol building.
Yeah, there's a famous photo of that, but that was shown to be just reflections of the streetlights.
Right, there's reflections of streetlights and also BBC recreation.
Yeah, I don't really know very much about the actual eyewitness accounts, but we have like all kinds of events that happen where people start looking up at the sky. There's like the Battle for Los Angeles, which I think was in World War II, where people thought that they saw things flying over Los Angeles, and they even had like searchlights focusing on these things, but they didn't really turn out to be anything substantial. I think, in cases where you see lots of people pointing at things, it's really surprising that nothing really comes of them. It almost seems like it's an event where people start pointing at the sky and saying, "Do you see that?" And they're like, "No, I don't see anything." And then they go, "No, look over there. Oh yeah, I see something." And then everyone gets all excited, and they start pointing at things, especially if there's something there, like some flares or something, or a plane flying over.
Well, that's why I think this 1952 sighting over Washington, D.C. is a real UFO, because it happened 2 weekends in a row. We had military jets in the sky chasing these things. A united flight, both the pilots and the crew members, they saw these objects. Ground observers saw these objects. And they were seen on 3 different radars, both civilian and military, calculated at 7,000 miles per hour. So that's not just some people seeing lights in the sky. That's jets chasing something that's in the sky with a physical radar signature that's moving 3 times faster than in the SR-71's top speed. So that's very anomalous to me, and something that is verifiable and something that we need to try to explain, because the official explanation was just temperature inversion, but everyone involved does not think it was a temperature inversion.
Interesting. Like 3 times as fast as the SR-71. It's very fast, faster than the speed of sound. Wouldn't there be a sonic boom?
There should be, but wouldn't there be a sonic boom in the Tic-Tac case? Those are going hypersonic, several times the speed of sound, and no sonic booms recorded.
Exactly.
So there's something that we don't understand.
So either it wasn't going faster than the speed of sound, or there's some incredible reality-altering physics going on to move the air out of the way.
It could manipulate space-time and move through the air with a bubble, and then you wouldn't have sonic booms. Or it could be a non-physical craft, some sort of plasma.
You know the Alcubierre drive? I can't remember how to pronounce it. There's this space warping drive, the one where it warps space in front of you. If you actually do that in an atmosphere, and apparently if you do the maths of what would happen in that, all the energy from the space warp still actually has to go somewhere. It still actually ends up creating this incredible, basically a big explosion of the air. And just the very idea of moving something from one point to another. It's at point A, it needs to get to point B, and it gets there in a tenth of a second, and it's moving like 10 times the speed of sound. It has to go through the air that's in between. So either you can have positing some kind of teleportation, or perhaps it didn't actually do that. And for me, this is a very big point strike against these things, that there were not any sonic booms, and there really isn't any plausible physical mechanism for avoiding them.
Well, then what would explain the radar signatures?
I would have to go with radar glitches, yes.
At the same time that people are seeing them?
No, it's not. I just don't... Kind of as we discussed earlier, we don't get any correlation between eyewitness video and radar at the same time. We don't see it, so no one saw it come down.
But in the 1952 case, they did have witnesses. There was a jet in the sky, and he said, "I'm surrounded, what do I do?" And they had all of this transpiring on radar. But
then did this jet pilot measure their departure speed visually?
No, it's at night, so.
I mean, it disappeared or flew away. I mean, depending on how close it was, it could look like anything. So you don't have the pilot corroborating this 3 times the speed of sound thing that the radar did. I mean, you have something in a region. Then you have a pilot going there, and he sees something in the region, and people assume they're the same thing. But I don't think it necessarily means they are the same thing. And really, I got to keep going back to this sonic boom thing. If you think about the air between 2 objects, it's there. You have to go through that air, which means either the air has to be, vaporized, or it needs to be pushed out of the way. And if it's pushed out of the way and then snaps back again, boom, sonic boom. That's where you get a sonic boom. Well, sonic boom's actually the wave.
If you have a warp drive, are you sure that you need to displace that air? I mean, the way I understand it is that you're pulling space-time around the craft. So you're just pulling the air around you and not necessarily displacing any air.
You still, topologically, you still have to go through the air, because even if you're warping the space to be smaller, you're still going through space. It's just all compressed together. So you're still going through that air, but now this air is all in one space. So it's even worse in a way. It means you're very, very rapidly going through a very dense region of air. And that's this Alcubierre drive, this space drive that people keep talking about, the warp space, doesn't work inside planets' atmospheres for that reason. That's why, and I don't want to jump to Star Trek, but if in Star Trek you can't go to warp whilst you're close to a planet. You can't warp space when you're I guess in a gravity well, but also in an atmosphere, because you get all this. The atmosphere would heat up and explode basically. So the warp drives, from what we know, would only work out away from a planet.
Hasn't NASA accelerated a laser beam slightly faster than the speed of light using similar technology to warp drives?
I'm going to go with no on that, because that would be very big news.
Well, I'll send it to you.
People often talk about things going faster than the speed of light, but they're not really going faster. I think that might be something to do with the superposition of waves, and the information is going faster than the speed of light in a medium. But you can't go faster than the speed of information. Cannot travel faster than the speed of light in a vacuum. That's kind of like a hard physical thing in the universe, as far as we know. Obviously, aliens might have figured it out, and that's something that Kaku talks about. That was an interesting thing Kaku said, actually. Michio Kaku, he says, we made the mistake of assuming the aliens are like us, but they might be 100,000 years ahead of us, in which case the laws of physics will have changed. Which I thought, coming from a physicist, was a pretty outrageous claim, because the laws of physics themselves aren't going to claim. We might discover some more refinements to the laws of physics, or maybe even some new laws of physics. But it doesn't mean just if we wait 100,000 years, the laws of physics are going to change, and that we'll automatically be able to have faster than light travel. Maybe we never have faster than light travel.
Yeah, I think he just meant that maybe our understanding of the laws of physics will change.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But I'd also like to talk about the burden of proof thing. So he said initially that it was up to the government to prove that they're not ET, and then he's walked back that statement a little bit to say it's up to the government to prove that UFOs are not real. And I think what this gets at is the Carl Sagan quote, "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." So I was searching your Metabunk site for explanations for the JAL 1628 case of the Japanese airline, the cargo airline that saw a massive UFO. And the only explanation, you haven't heard of it?
I don't remember it.
Okay. Well, the only explanation that I saw on your site is that it's a squadron of B-2 bombers, and that makes absolutely no sense to me, because a craft that's 4 times the size of a 747 was seen visually and on radar by the FAA, and a B-2 bomber would have a tiny radar signature the size of a bird. So it's obviously not that. And the craft is moving around at hypersonic speeds, and B-2 bombers are not even hypersonic. They're not even supersonic. They're subsonic. So there's almost no chance that that's what it was. And in my mind, what he's saying is that if you want to come up with these extreme debunking theories by the government or just average citizens, if you want to say that it's not something outside of our understanding, you need to explain how a B-2 bomber could possibly explain that scenario.
He, I think, when he made that statement, he said that the burden of proof has shifted. He was very specifically referring to these 3 videos from the Navy.
He was.
And he was saying that he talked before that about different types of evidence. We talked about, I guess, science. Like he says, in science, you want things that are testable, like, and repeatable, and falsifiable. Yeah. And he says that we now have that with these 3 videos. And because we have these 3 videos, and then he said that they showed like impossible accelerations and things like that, then the burden of proof has shifted. And that's what I'm saying is wrong if you're just looking at these 3 videos. Now, you're saying that there's all these other examples of evidence as well that give the same argument. But is this stuff that Kaku was not aware of before? Does he really think that this is the first time that there's evidence of this quality? Or is there something special about these videos?
Well, for that case in particular, the CIA and the FBI confiscated the radar data, so that goes back to the cover-up. And then in Blue Book, you had a deliberate intention to debunk UFOs. So all of the UFO cases that pertained to national security didn't even make it into Blue Book. So you only have sort of the lesser UFO cases in this project, and then you're explicitly televising, giving publicity to all of the cases that you can successfully debunk, and then you're hiding the ones that you can't debunk. It was very clear that that was their intention, and the civilian scientist, J. Allen Hynek, he's criticized them repeatedly for doing this, and also the public was criticizing them at the time for doing this. So he wrote a letter to the Air Force and other agencies later to get a re-examination of Project Blue Book, and that's how we got the Condon Committee at the University of Colorado, where I went to school. And that whole scientific report was also rigged, just in the same way Project Blue Book was, and it's still used by the government and mainstream academics to say that there's nothing to UFOs, but that's a bit of a contradiction, because in this report it says a scientist with a well-thought-out plan to study UFOs and proper credentials should be supported, even though we didn't find any evidence. And it's very clear that they weren't looking for any evidence, because United States Marine Corps Major Donald Kehoe, he said that the United States Air Force had a letter that said that the UFO phenomenon is extraterrestrial. He was cut off the air by CBS when he was talking about a Senate committee investigating this sort of thing. He says the Air Force cut him off the radio while he was talking. And then he briefs this Condon committee. And a short while after that, Edward Condon, who's the head of this committee, he replies, there's nothing to this UFO phenomenon. It's complete nonsense. And then he pauses and adds, but I'm not supposed to reach that conclusion for another year. So this whole committee already had a predetermined conclusion before they even examined the data. And that's why you had half of the committee leave halfway through, because they had a mutiny. They didn't agree with the scientific methodology. So it's very clear that all of these reports are a cover-up. And as you said, the Navy has said that all of this will be classified going forward. So it really is covered up from the public and from academia.
So recently, like Harry Reid got a program funded, not recently, it was like, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, which I believe was called AATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And that was funded to the tune of like $22 million over 5 years. And obviously that money got spent somewhere. Was that part of the cover-up?
This is going to be almost all speculation, but it could be part of, as many have suggested, a drift disclosure. I don't agree with that. I actually agree with what Seth Shostak had said on your last episode, where it's almost naive to expect a disclosure from the government. We can only pressure elected officials, and if they're not privy to this sort of deep secret classified information by black projects, black budgets, if they don't even have the access to this information, they can't possibly disclose it. So I think it's possible that what Bigelow did, because he was an integral part of creating this ATIP with Harry Reid, he created ATIP. They spent this money. Have you seen the list of experiments in the John McCain letter?
Yes, I have. Not really experiments as such. They're more kind of like theoretical
Studies.
papers and stuff.
Right.
Warp drives
and
whatnot.
They spent the money on that, possibly also investigating some UAPs, trying to identify them. And after this funding dries up, he's going to want to continue that research, right? He's a private citizen. He's very interested in UFOs. He became a billionaire for the express purpose of studying UFOs. So once his funding dries up, he's going to want to keep going with the same research that he had already going. And so he might have created TTSA secretly, which is evidenced by a selfie with him, Luis Elizondo, Tom DeLonge, all together around the same time of that formation. And then TTSA would be a continuation of ATIP because it has many of the same scientists. Eric Davis, who is doing the metamaterials analysis currently at Hal Puthoff's company, which is called Earth Tech, who was also, both of these scientists were working on those theoretical papers. Luis Elizondo is a carryover. Colm Kelleher is from the NIDS investigation of the paranormal activities at Skinwalker Ranch, also funded by Bigelow. So Bigelow is kind of using all of these same people in a new organization that's much more public, and he also has the advantage of having these 3 videos that he might have paid Elizondo to release or that the government authorized for release, and then he has the legitimacy of the ATIP program to back up his new public company, which is TTSA. So it's
interesting
complete
theory.
speculation.
Yeah. So I wonder, though, you feel things have changed in the last 5 years in terms of how UFOs are viewed and what information we have that verifies that UFOs are real?
It's a very tricky question. On the surface, yes. So we've never really had an admission. I mean, you could say the Air Force or the Army back in the 40s and 50s admitted some things, but we've never had a direct admission in recent times by the military that there are craft flying around in our battle spaces above our aircraft carriers that we can't identify. So that alone, saying that these are real, verified UAPs, that is a change in the dialogue. And the more interesting change in the Discord or the discourse is the mainstream media. All of a sudden, it went from 50, 60 years of being ridiculed and not being taken seriously, intentionally not being taken seriously, because that was part of the cover-up. You can hide it if it's ridiculed. But now the Navy pilots are on the mainstream media. We have Luis Elizondo Public from ATIP, and all of these channels and the New York Times, they're all taking it very, very seriously, and they're saying it's real. We don't know what it is. So that is the most interesting public relations change that I can see. But as far as me personally, I don't think that we're headed towards disclosure just yet.
But you feel that this change in the media thing is a deliberate thing? Like the media is being directed to do this somehow?
It's likely. It's also possible that they just realize that they can make more money by playing up the threat factor, which is an unknown threat, but they can make more money by legitimizing UFOs than they can by ridiculing it. So it was relegated to only tabloids. And now they've realized after the New York Times article, which in fact was written by a UFO author, Leslie Kane, and now they've realized that they can make more ad revenue by publishing these serious stories that a lot of people read. So it could be deliberate, or it could just be, as everything else is, just money.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know. So you don't feel like disclosure's around the corner?
I don't, and I also wanted to say that Lawrence Rockefeller had a meeting with Stephen Greer, Robert Bigelow, Linda Moulton Howe, all of these big names in ufology, and he also wrote a letter to the Clintons to say that they should press the government to do disclosure, and that's why I think both of the Clintons in their presidential campaigns made a move towards disclosure, but obviously that wasn't successful. So there might be something above the presidency that controls this information, and we just can't get it from our elected officials.
Interesting theory. I'd have to say I personally would not agree with that. I feel like there's really nothing there other than that sometimes we get unidentified craft in military airspace just because people fly drones into it, or sometimes aircraft go in there, and sometimes enemy nations go in there. So that's kind of my take on what's going on. And I also feel that it's inevitable that you will have some kind of unidentified craft in every arena. Like, I'm sure airline pilots see them all the time.
I do.
I see my little white dots in the backyard, which I assume are planes or birds. But yeah, I don't really think personally that there is this big cover-up going on. But it would be great if there was something interesting going on. That's something I think Seth Shostak said, that if there was a good chance, a good indication that there was alien craft, then he would be studying it. But he doesn't really think that there is. Hopefully we'll find out. What's kind of coming down the line? Like what is there stuff like that's supposed to happen soon? Like,
well, Bob Bigelow definitely believes in UFOs, and you just mentioned the commercial airline pilots. Actually, they were instructed in the FAA manuals to report all of their UFO sightings to Bob Bigelow. Mm-hmm. So there might be something going on with him doing a private cover-up almost, because he has bought the records of MUFON, and he's also bought metamaterials with taxpayer money, and now those are being analyzed by not an independent laboratory, but as I said, EarthTech International, which is Hal Puthoff's company, who's part of TTSA. So I think that there's a need for more transparency, both in the government and in companies like TTSA. But TTSA, as you said, what's coming down the line, they said that they're going to make a big announcement soon, so fingers crossed that that's actually important, and it's real analysis of metamaterials.
think they said it would be this week, which is just finished. So
yeah, they said it was going to be last week. So where is it?
Yeah, so we'll see. The Bigelow UFO reporting. I have a friend who is an air traffic controller, and he says that they're pretty happy about that because now they don't have to deal with UFO reports from people, because they would get not from pilots so much. They don't mind that. They would get people calling in, the general public, saying, I saw a light in the sky, what is that? And then say, oh, well, just call this number now. So Bigelow has to deal with it all. All right, so any, we're kind of gone over our hour here. Any kind of final thoughts about what you personally are going to do with your interest in UFOs?
Well, I'm just trying to legitimize UFOs, coming on your channel, trying to take it seriously, prove that there is a cover-up, and also on my YouTube channel, TheoryQED, I'm trying to analyze UFOs in a critical thinking sort of way to not debunk everything, not believe everything, but try to look at the data and see what is debunkable and what is anomalous that we should pay attention to. But I have a few questions for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So, do you think it's possible that ET could visit Earth, or are you just completely discounting that as a possibility because of the time and distance involved?
Well, no, I certainly think it's possible, but I think it would be just an incredible coincidence that it would happen at this time, just because for one thing, we can't see any evidence of alien life nearby in the universe, and it doesn't seem incredibly likely that civilizations would last a very, very, very long time. We've been in this civilization on Earth has only been around 10,000 years, and technological civilization has only been around basically like 100 years. So the idea that some alien civilization will be in sync with us and just come to visit us, yeah, sure, it's possible. But is it a probable thing based on what we know about the universe and the little we know about how civilizations develop? I think that if there was alien life nearby in the galaxy, in the nearby stars, we would see evidence of it in space, and it wouldn't just be nothing in space and some aliens on Earth.
But if our detection capabilities increase both with satellites and other technologies, and we did find life, we would certainly send a probe there, right? So I think it makes sense to assume that aliens would do the same.
I don't think we would send a probe there, not for a few thousand years. Yeah. You would first. The problem with sending a probe, it depends how far away it is. Obviously, the big problem with space travel is that it takes hundreds of years to get anywhere, unless it just happens to be on the star. Even if it was on one of the nearby stars, like if it was on the closest star, they're like 2 or 3 light years away, you could send a radio signal there and get a response back. So first of all, you try to do that. But most of the stars. There's thousands of stars within 100 light years, but that's going to take 1,000 years for a probe to get there. Maybe we would, but would we send craft that are capable of flying around and shadowing the Nimitz fleet or something like that? No, we'd probably send something that was more like a static craft that would do a little gravitational slingshot around the star or something like that. It just doesn't seem. Obviously we'd want to go there. Sounds great, but what's the odds of it actually happening in terms of synchronizing technological development?
I think the greatest likelihood of getting around that great filter that you're talking about with the synchronization of civilizations is if we become, either through transhumanism or just through the creation of an AI or an AGI, a superintelligence of machine learning and machine intelligence. If that intelligence can make self-replicating probes, it could search the galaxy relatively quickly and then also have insane technologies that we can't even dream of yet.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and that's something I brought up with Seth, but he kind of poo-pooed it a bit. But I think it's a pretty solid idea that there would be these robots going throughout the galaxy. And the future, unfortunately, probably is with robots rather than with humans. So
that's my last question, if we have time, is why do you think that these academics... Sorry, I'm going over. Yeah. But why do you think Neil deGrasse Tyson and Seth Shostak and also Bill Nye the Science Guy, why do you think they're so adamantly opposed to the idea of extraterrestrial visitation? They don't even entertain the idea whatsoever.
I don't think they're adamantly opposed to it, but they adamantly feel that the evidence is pointing against it in terms of not being able to detect alien life. And, I think perhaps they're a little bit stuck in their ways. But they probably know a lot more about astrophysics than we do. So maybe their perspective on astrophysics actually gives them insight into the likelihood of things. Like, they understand how far away these stars are, and they understand how many of the nearby stars might have habitable planets. And they've no doubt given some thought to the development of civilizations and what the actual numbers are in terms of, will there be something nearby? So, yeah, maybe, TV scientists, they're not all that. I don't think Michio Kaku is really has a good point at all. And, Neil deGrasse Tyson often says stupid things. And I'm sure Bill Nye and whoever the other guy was, Seth, maybe, they also get things wrong from time to time. But if all things are being equal, I kind of would defer to an astrophysicist over my own personal opinion.
Well, thanks for having me on. It was really fun, and I think we found some middle ground here, so that was great.
Sure. No, it's great. Thank you for being on, and it's always great to talk to someone about these things. I am going to talk to UFO Jesus in a few days.
That. I'm excited for it.
That'll be interesting. He's got a kind of a different personality to you, I think, and it will be interesting to see what he does. I might even talk to Nick Pope as well. I'm doing like UFO month, I think, this month. Then I might have to go back to something more entertaining, like Flat Earth, after that. We shall see. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Ian.
I appreciate it. Thanks.